Reading the Times for Tuesday, February 25th, 2020. Harvey Weinstein is found guilty of sex crimes in Me Too watershed. Harvey Weinstein, the powerhouse film producer whose downfall over sexual misconduct ignited a global movement, was found guilty of 2 felony sex crimes after a trial in which 6 women testified he had sexually assaulted them. The criminal charges brought in Manhattan against Mr. Weinstein, 67, rested narrowly on the complaints of 2 women, Miriam Haley, a production assistant who said he had forced oral sex on her in 2006, and Jessica Mann, a former actress who alleged he had raped her at a hotel 2013. Jurors also had to consider the testimony of the actress Annabella Sciorra, who said Mr. Weinstein had raped her in the early 1990s in deciding whether he was a sexual predator. From the start, much about the story of Mr. Weinstein's mistreatment of women has been outsized, from the number of women who accused him, at least 90, to the range of the alleged misconduct, everything from lewd propositions and unwanted touching to forced oral sex and rape. With Weinstein conviction, jury delivers a verdict on Me Too. For decades, Mr. Weinstein used high-priced lawyers and secret settlements to silence women with allegations of sexual misconduct against him. At one point, as one accuser, Jessica Mann, described his genitals, Mr. Weinstein hung his head. To counter the allegations, Mr. Weinstein and his legal team drummed home the message that #MeToo had spun out of control. Jane Manning, a former Queen prosecutor and founder of the Women's Equal Justice Project, said she hoped the Weinstein case would inspire other prosecutors around the country to pursue similarly challenging cases. U.S. stocks plunge as coronavirus crisis spreads. The S&P 500 dropped nearly 3% at the start of trading, after European markets recorded their worst day since 2016, and major benchmarks in Asia were also sharply lower. Delta Airlines and American Airlines were both more than 4.5% lower, while shares of Apple, which said last week that the outbreak in China was hurting both its supply of iPhones and demand for the devices, fell more than 5% in early trading. In Europe, major benchmarks were down 3% or more. As Trump barricades the border, legal immigration is starting to plunge. President Trump's immigration policies, like travel bans and visa restrictions, or refugee caps and asylum changes, have begun to deliver on a long-standing goal. Legal immigration has fallen more than 11%, and a steeper cut is looming. While Mr. Trump highlights the construction of a border wall to stress his war on illegal immigration, it is through policy changes, not physical barriers, that his administration has been able to seal the United States. Even before the policy went into force, it discouraged immigrants and citizens in immigrant families from seeking public assistance they qualify for, such as Medicaid, food stamps, free or reduced price school meals, or housing help, according to immigration analysts. Katherine Johnson dies at 101. Mathematician broke barriers at the CIA. In old age, Mrs. Johnson became the most celebrated of the small cadre of black women, perhaps 3 dozen, who at mid-century served as mathematicians for the space agency and its predecessor, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. In 2017, NASA dedicated a building in her honor, the Katherine G. Johnson Computational Research Facility, at its Langley Research Center in Hampton, Virginia. That year, the Washington Post described her as the most high-profile of the computers. Computers being a term originally used to designate Mrs. Johnson and her colleagues, much as typewriters was used in the 19th century to denote professional typists. Mrs. Johnson's colleague, Mary Jackson, died in 2005. Dorothy Vaughan died in 2008. In 2016, Mrs. Johnson, self-effacing as ever at 98, seemed somewhat indifferent to the fuss surrounding the feature film about her life. Sanders says he'll attract a wave of new voters. It hasn't happened. Jeff Weaver, a top strategist to Mr. Sanders, pointed to strong performance with working-class voters in places like Manchester, New Hampshire, and Latino voters in Nassau, New Hampshire, and categorically rebuffed questions about Sanders' turnout machine. In Nevada, Mr. Sanders won non-white voters by a 19-point margin, according to an entrance poll, far greater than his 10-point margin among white voters. During a rally at the University of Houston on Sunday, after his commanding victory in Nevada, Mr. Sanders, as he had in Iowa, New Hampshire, and Nevada, aspired to a large voter turnout on Super Tuesday when voting takes place in Texas and 13 other states. America loves India, Trump declares at rally with Modi. President Trump began a 2-day visit to India by joining Prime Minister Narendra Modi for a campaign-style rally in a 110,000-seat cricket stadium that illustrated the populist bond between the two men and impressed a president who revels in spectacle. Mr. Trump said that he and Mr. Modi would eventually be making a very, very major trade deals, but added that they are in the early stages of discussion. Mr. Modi was a tough negotiator, he joked. Mr. Trump has shown little public concern for actions by Mr. Modi that have drawn international condemnation, including abruptly revoking the statehood of predominantly Muslim Kashmir and backing a law establishing a religious test for new migrants that critics call evidence of plans to turn India into a Hindu-centric state whose 200 million Muslims would be second-class citizens. Under pressure from Trump, extraditions to U.S. from Mexico soar. In all of 2019, 58 suspects were extradited to the United States, according to Mexico's Attorney General's office, with 69 sent in 2018 and 57 in 2017. The increased numbers of extraditions in the early months of 2020 come as President Andrés Manuel López Obrador of Mexico, who took office in December of 2018, has struggled to show gains in his government's effort to rein in organized crime groups and the violence they sow. The authorities have recently discovered large fentanyl labs in Mexico, possibly alarming American officials that Mexico could soon replace China as a source of illegally manufactured fentanyl, Mr. Hope said. Mexican officials have at times been reluctant to comply with these requests, citing national sovereignty or the desire to see the suspect prosecuted and imprisoned in Mexico. Sandstorm wreaks havoc in Canary Islands. Winds from the Sahara continued to send streams of sand drifting over the Canary Islands on Monday, creating chaos as the swirling sands forced planes to be grounded, disrupted traffic, and exacerbated wildfires. Angel Victor Torres, the regional president of the islands, which are a Spanish archipelago, told Spanish national television that it was the worst such storm to hit the islands in 40 years and described its arrival as a nightmare weekend. The strong winds also fueled the spread of wildfires on the islands of Tenerife and Gran Canaria, with one blaze consuming a banana plantation of La Palma. Mahathir Mohamad, Malaysia's prime minister, resigns. Mahathir Mohamad, the 94-year-old prime minister of Malaysia, and his perennial presumptive heir, Anwar Ibrahim, joined forces in 2018 to oust a governing party to which both had once belonged. Mr. Mahathir's unexpected resignation also raises questions about the future of political and economic overhauls in a country where Malay nationalist politics were promoted during Mr. Mahathir's first term in office from 1981 to 2003 and look to be gaining ground again. Lim Guan Eng, Malaysia's finance minister, and the leader of a Chinese majority party that pledged on Monday to continue backing Mr. Mahathir, released a statement saying that the prime minister has resigned not because he wanted to outmaneuver Mr. Anwar, but because he was disgusted with members of his coalition who had plotted to join the UMNO in neighboring Singapore. Goh Chok Tong, the former Prime Minister of Singapore, took to Twitter to express his astonishment with the political tumult in Malaysia. Julian Assange faces hearing on extradition to the U.S. Julian Assange, the WikiLeaks founder, who spent 7 years holed up in the Ecuadorian embassy in London before being evicted and arrested last year, was back in court on Monday fighting extradition to the United States. With the departure in 2017 of Ecuador's leftist president, Rafael Correa, who had granted him asylum, Mr. Assange's days in the embassy were numbered. Mr. Assange's legal team had also sought to tie their client to President Trump, telling the court that former Representative Dana Rohrabacher of California, an ally of the president, had offered a pardon to Mr. Assange on Mr. Trump's behalf if the WikiLeaks founder were to say that Russia had nothing to do with the 2016 hacking of the Democratic National Committee. Spreading across continents, a lethal virus tests a fraying global order. The emergence of Italy, Iran, and South Korea as new hubs of the outbreak underscored the lack of a coordinated global strategy to combat the coronavirus, which has infected nearly 80,000 people in 37 countries, causing at least 2,600 deaths. China's President Xi Jinping acknowledged that it was the country's most serious public health crisis and the most difficult to prevent and control since the founding of the People's Republic. Underscoring the point, the country's leaders on Monday were forced to postpone their biggest political conclave of the year, the National People's Congress. Coronavirus stalls Milan, Italy's economic engine. Milan is not a closed city, but it is a drastically slowed one after Italy experienced a surge in coronavirus cases concentrated mostly, though not exclusively, around Milan, Italy's economic engine, cultural capital, and most dynamic city. While Milan is far from panicked, there is a growing anxiety, if not about the virus spread, then of its broader impact on the city's life and economy, and the drag a hobbled Lombardy region could have on the rest of Italy's fragile economy. A Turkish student at Bocconi, Milan's premier economics university, which had canceled classes for the next week, said she had a ticket to Turkey Tuesday morning because she feared getting stuck in Milan if the government decided to lock it down. Recipe for a massive viral outbreak. Iran emerges as a worldwide threat. Iran's health minister sent a letter to the governor of Qom on Thursday and asked Shiite religious leaders to limit the number of pilgrims at the shrine to Fatima Masumeh and other religious sites in the city. But as of early Tuesday, throngs of people still gathered around the shrine, touching it and taking part in communal prayers. At least 61 others had been infected in Iran, the official said, with new cases being reported in Isfahan, Hamadan, and other cities, as well as in Qom. Now the slow drip of news about the spread of the virus is compounding Tehran's already acute credibility problems, less than 2 months after officials were forced to admit lying about their knowledge of the accidental downing of a Ukrainian passenger jet by air defense systems. On Monday, Dr. Gadir said on Iran's state television network that the health ministry had ordered city officials not to publish any statistics related to the outbreak in Qom. Businesses getting killed on Russian border as coronavirus fears rise. No one in a Russian city 600 yards from China has been infected yet, but businesses are shriveling, and China's image as a benign force is being eclipsed by a more anxious vision. Heilongjiang, until the virus started killing people in Wuhan, China, and spreading fear far beyond. Blagoveshchik had staked its future on ever closer relations with China, harnessing its economy to burgeoning cross-border commerce and a flood of traffic across the river by boat in the summer and over a pontoon bridge laid on the ice in the winter. Alexander Kozin, a Russian who lives mostly in Hain but is now stuck on the Russian side of the river, is such a fervent admirer of China's economic and political model that he thinks a secret American laboratory could have created the new coronavirus as a weapon to undermine China's success and image. Bum, 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 bum. I lost my place. White House asks Congress for billions to fight coronavirus. Now, with Mr. Trump in India, stock prices are tumbling on coronavirus fears, and health officials around the nation are struggling to keep up with the cost of screening and monitoring passengers arriving from China and other parts of the world where the virus has spread. Representatives Nita M. Lowy of New York, the chairwoman of the House Appropriation Committee, and Rosa DeLauro, who leads the subcommittee that funds health programs, were hardly laudatory as the Department of Health and Human Services prepared to act. Before the coronavirus outbreak, the Trump administration had already drastically narrowed its epidemic work in countries around the world, and it has offered federal health security programs less money in the past few years than health experts say is needed to help with the containment. Last week, Mr. Cassidy and Mr. Schatz introduced legislation with 4 other colleagues from both parties that would automatically fund a permanent pool of public health emergency money, allowing the health secretary to dispense resources the way that the Federal Emergency Management Agency does with natural disasters, without as much dependence on congressional action. As fears of a pandemic mount, WHO says world is not ready. After 2 weeks on the ground in China, a team sent by WHO concluded that the draconian measures China imposed a month ago may have saved hundreds of thousands of people from infection. The number of new infections in China have been steadily dropping, giving officials in the country confidence that the extraordinary measures have been effective in blunting the virus's spread. At the same time, new cases are escalating outside China. Liang Wannian, a senior official with China's National Health Commission, said China was not ready to declare victory yet. A rare legal battle. Can a state force a city to house coronavirus patients? Judge Staten of the U.S. District Court for the Central District of California pressed state officials to explain why it selected a facility in the second most populated county in the state of California. The state's lawyers argued that the officials in Costa Mesa have no legal right or good reason to block the move, which the state said involved frail and elderly patients. The federal government generally relies on states to carry out quarantine orders, and states are within their rights to refuse. Westerdam passengers at low risk of coronavirus infection, CDC says. Testing for the coronavirus has proved problematic, said Dr. Jennifer Nuzzo, an epidemiologist at Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, and questions have been raised about the test sensitivity. A diagnostic test produced by the CDC and sent to the state health departments turned out to be flawed, and new test kits must be manufactured. South Korea has tested more than 20,000 people. We have tested probably under 1,000. Trump's doctor thought he had a ticket to Congress. It hasn't been so easy. Dr. Jackson left the West Wing in December after rising from President Trump's physician to his unlikely pick to lead the Department of Veteran Affairs to Trump administration roadkill when he was forced to withdraw his name from consideration amid allegations related to his professional conduct. Dr. Jackson is benefiting, if belatedly, from Trump allies and aides who have only recently realized they needed help and have pitched in, setting him up with a real online fundraising and phone prospecting operation, which helped to finally get him on air with a commercial, a 30-second spot made up entirely of old clips of Mr. Trump praising his character. Dr. Jackson, who served the White House medical unit under the past 3 presidents, grew close to Mr. Trump after delivering the results of a presidential physical in a briefing at which he promoted Mr. Trump's incredible genes. And he said he did exceedingly well on a cognitive test and claimed that if he had adhered to a better diet over the past 20 years, he could have lived to be 200. His hour-long news conference transformed Dr. Jackson into an inner circle Trump favorite and a candidate, in Trump's mind, for a cabinet post. McConnell, looking to energize social conservatives, forces votes on abortion. These are all deeply connected efforts to put abortion out of reach, and they are trying to use other language, said Fatima Goss Graves, the president of the National Women's Law Center, who testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee in opposition to the Born Alive bill. A federal judge last week blocked a Mississippi bill banning abortion after 6 weeks. The partisan divide over abortion is deepening, and surveys have shown that support for late-term abortion is not as robust. Appeal of Lee Malvo, the sniper who terrorized D.C., may be dismissed. In his Supreme Court case, Mathena versus Malvo number 18-217, Mr. Malvo talent challenged his sentences of life in prison without the possibility of parole. As a practical matter, a ruling from the Supreme Court in Mr. Malvo's favor would not have helped him. In 2018, a unanimous 3-judge panel of the United States Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit in Richmond, Virginia, ruled for Mr. Malvo, saying he was entitled to a new sentencing hearing. Among those pressing Trump to weed out disloyalty, Clarence Thomas's wife. For the past 18 months, Jeannie Thomas, the wife of Justice Clarence Thomas, and other conservatives have plied the White House with memos and suggestions about which people to fire and who should replace them. Among Ms. Thomas's top targets have been officials at the National Security Council, the former head of the White House Personnel Office, Sean Ducey, and other top White House aides, despite her own history of supporting Senator Ted Cruz of Texas for the Republican presidential nomination and of trying to stop Mr. Trump at the 2016 Republican National Convention. Ms. Thomas had presented herself to the White House as a barometer of who is sufficiently conservative and supportive of the Trump agenda, according to current and former administration officials. Bill would require an anti-government critic in more surveillance cases. The House Judiciary Committee is preparing to unveil a bill that would require a secretive intelligence court to appoint an outsider to critique the government's arguments when national security investigators seek wiretap orders that could affect political campaigns or religious organizations. The draft bill would expand the trigger for appointing such a critic to include applications that present significant concern with respect to the activities of a United States person that are protected by the First Amendment, meaning investigations that touch on the political or religious activity. The draft bill would also expand the power of such friends of the court by permitting them to file appeals if the FISA court grants the government's request for orders over their objections, and by requiring the government to give them access to all the materials they need to evaluate a request. At Supreme Court, a case on abuse of the no-fly list. Ramzi Kassem, a law professor at the City University of New York, and a lawyer with a clinic there that represents Mr. Tanvir, said the case would test the court's commitment to religious liberty. The 1993 law, Judge Rosemary S. Pooler wrote for the panel, allowed Mr. Tanvir to seek money from the agents for the harm he had suffered. Prominent law professors and religious groups have filed briefs supporting Mr. Tanvir, but the earlier ruling suggests he faces an uphill battle in the case. Tanzine versus Tanvir, number 19-71. In a Supreme Court brief, the administration urged the justices not to interfere with its efforts to protect the nation. A shot before last call, capturing New Orleans' vanishing black bars. 4 of the 6 nearby bars, all of which were once owned and operated by black people and served black customers, now have white owners and cater to a primarily white crowd. At night, all you saw was black people, said Mr. Dawkins, who's in his late 60s. Black spaces and halls, predecessors to black-owned bars, were established as a result of segregation, and many were owned by benevolent societies, social clubs, or fraternal organizations. Just off St. Bernard Avenue, a number of black-owned places, like Bullet Sports Bar and Bertha's Place Bar and Restaurant, continue to thrive. Supreme Court to hear case on gay rights and foster care. In 2018, the Supreme Court refused to decide the central issue in that case, whether businesses may claim exemptions from anti-discrimination laws on religious grounds. The agency asked the court to use the case to reconsider an important precedent limiting First Amendment protections for religious practices. Justice Samuel A. Alito, Jr., joined by Justices Clarence Thomas and Neil M. Gorsuch, issued a concurring opinion saying the court should, in a future case, consider how flexible employers must be in accommodating their workers' religious practices. Putin's ultimate goal. Most of the information coming out in public is through leaks to the news media, very likely for political gain. Are you in New York City? Join me in New York Times politics team on March 4th. The day after Super Tuesday, as we dive into all the winners, losers, and head-scratching moments of the race. We ask you, on Politics Readers, to tell us how the results in Iowa and New Hampshire affected your view of the race. So that was obviously not what the article is about. Tom Steyer stirs more debate over payments in South Kakalaka. Since October, the Steyer campaign has paid more than $40,000 to the company, 49 Magnolia Blossom LLC, for rental of its state headquarters office in Columbia, according to the document submitted by the Steyer campaign. Mr. Steyer's campaign also defended the decision to rent from Miss Reed. As a grassroots organizer, Tom's made a commitment to hire local organizers who understand their communities and invest in local business and organizations to leave something behind after the campaign moves on, said a statement released by Mr. Steyer's spokesman, Benjamin Gerdes. Allegations of vote buying involving Mr. Steyer cropped up on social media last week after the pastor of Brooklyn Baptist Church, one of the largest black churches in the state, announced during Sunday services that the church planned to apply for a grant from a charitable foundation established by Mr. Steyer and Miss Taylor. Sanders' comments on Fidel Castro provoke anger in Florida. Cuban exiles and Democrats in Florida on Monday angrily rejected comments from Senator Bernie Sanders praising aspects of the communist Cuban Revolution that aired in an interview with 60 Minutes. In the interview, which aired Sunday night on CBS, Mr. Sanders said he opposed the authoritarian nature of repressive Cuban regime. Senator Sanders has clearly and consistently criticized Fidel Castro's authoritarianism and condemned his human rights abuses. And he's simply echoing President Obama's acknowledgement that Cuba made progress, especially in education. Mike Casca, the campaign communications director, said, Bernie Sanders outlines funding for his plans, but it may not all add up. The actual document is somewhat limited, and in some cases, the revenue Mr. Sanders identifies doesn't match the cost of his plans. If Mr. Sanders has plans to fill that gap, he did not mention them in his outline or in his interview on Sunday. Asked about his comments in the town hall on Monday, Mr. Sanders repeated the example of Castro's literacy programs and said he had been extremely consistent and critical of all authoritarian regimes all over the world, including Cuba, including Nicaragua, including Saudi Arabia, including China, including Russia. I'm going to have to ask you again to make a small contribution to my campaign so that way we can win in 2020 and empower the people-led revolution. Divisiveness among 2020 Democratic hopefuls hits new level. As push comes to shove in the Democratic primary, candidates and their surrogates have descended to a level of personal animus that was rare before the era of President Trump. On Monday, Joseph R. Biden Jr. launched a digital ad in South Kakalaka saying Bernie Sanders can't be trusted after weighing a 2012 primary against our first African-American president, Barack Obama. On Saturday night, after Mr. de Blasio, a surrogate for Mr. Sanders, tweeted at Mr. Buttigieg saying, dude, show some humility, come on. Mr. Lockhart immediately replied to the New York mayor, who cares what you think? Amy Klobuchar's bipartisan record includes voting for many Trump judicial nominees. At least two of the judges backed by Ms. Klobuchar, Judge Strauss and Judge Newsom, have been listed on Mr. Trump's short list of candidates he would consider to fill vacancies on the Supreme Court. Perhaps none of Ms. Klobuchar's votes surprised more of her fellow Democrats than her support for Judge Strauss, a conservative judge from her home state. As president, Amy Klobuchar will prioritize reversing the damage done by Trump-appointed judges by quickly moving to fill vacancies with judges in the vein of Justices Kagan, Sotomayor, Breyer, and Ginsburg, it said. The lessons of #MeToo's monster. The case, tried in a Manhattan courtroom, rested on the testimony of just 6 women out of more than 90 who have accused Mr. Weinstein of sexual misconduct. Mr. Weinstein's prosecutors were able to break through a barrier common to many assault cases, a lack of physical or other corroborating evidence. Mr. Weinstein's lead lawyer said her client was simply a target of a cause and of a movement. That's correct. If the cause is holding sexual abusers to account, and the movement is a national shift in consciousness over these crimes that arose in large part out of the revelation of Mr. Weinstein's behavior. Republican cynicism may win Trump re-election. Trump inherited a $600 billion deficit. He's blown that up to $1 trillion, and hardly a single Republican in Congress has expressed dismay. How much have Trump's deficits boosted the economy? Well, their poorly designed stimulus, the biggest item, was tax cuts for corporations, which corporations use to buy back stock rather than to expand their business or raise wages. The VSPs have gone oddly silent under Trump. Funny how that works, but they'll surely be back if Democrats retake the White House. Putin would hate President Bernie Sanders. Further, Russia's investment in Donald Trump has paid off handsomely, and the country's leaders evidently believe, just as many American pundits do, that Sanders would be Trump's weakest opponent. In a demagogic appearance on ABC News this weekend, Trump's national security advisor claimed that Russia had an interest in seeing Sanders prevail in 2020. Well, there's reports that they want Bernie Sanders to get elected president. That's no surprise. He honeymooned in Moscow. Russia hasn't been a communist in decades, and it is Trump, not Sanders, who fawns over Putin and other despots, including Stalinist madman Kim Jong-un. What is the power of celibacy? The controversy centered on whether certain married church deacons would be permitted to offer mass in churches too remote for priests to reach regularly, while the church was kept purified by the fires of persecution, explained the 19th century religious historian Henry Charles Leah. It offered few attractions for the worldly and ambitious, but as prospects of wealth and power opened up, the church would have to protect itself from a new class of men, dangerous alike for the talents or their vices. Celibacy was one way of preventing such wolves from seeking a place among the sheep. It also prevented priestly dynasties. The church historian Hubert Wolff warned in the Washington Post last summer that without reform of the celibacy rules, the church will be at its end. Is it a pandemic yet? Some 152 cases were confirmed in Italy on Sunday, up from 3 cases on Thursday. Even the best system is too fragile, and a moderate increase in infectious cases, whether from a seasonal flu or COVID-19, can quickly overwhelm resources in China or the United States. Basic information is still lacking or isn't getting through. According to a recent survey, 65% of people in Hong Kong had enough surgical masks for a month or more. This even though such masks will do little to prevent the spread of COVID-19. Singapore, which is experiencing an outbreak despite a world-class medical and public health system, 89 cases as of Sunday, is the module to emulate. Where's that model? It's a model to emulate. The Democratic race after Nevada. Donald Trump must not be allowed another 4 years in office. The same people who held their noses and voted for Donald Trump 2016 because they came to mistrust Hillary Clinton will do the same thing in November. But this time it is Mr. Trump who is despised and mistrusted. In our last presidential campaign, Donald Trump's message was, what have we got to lose? Now we know. Dignity, respect, truth, compassion, trust, spine. 2 OB-GYNs on pelvic exams and patients' consent at our academic medical center, Yale New Haven Hospital. We have worked to educate faculty and trainees to ensure that patients are counseled about the care they receive and the team involved. Ethos Capital's acquisitions of Public Interest Registry, which runs .org from the Internet Society, means that the registry can invest more in its own operations and help more nonprofits be online. The Internet Society, which relies substantially on the registry's surplus income, will now have a predictable endowment of more than $1 billion to support its global efforts to make the Internet more accessible and secure. Fix for a hated NYC highway. How about an $11 billion tunnel? Mayor Bill de Blasio and city transportation officials would have to embrace any plan for the highway, and the city has already reviewed and rejected the idea of a tunnel because of financial and logistical challenges, including digging in areas with subway lines and water tunnels and below residential neighborhoods with historic buildings. City officials have planned for a far cheaper project in the range of $3 billion to $4 billion. $1.7 billion has been earmarked for the BQE reconstruction in the city's capital plan. City transportation officials have warned for years that the highway has to be fixed. A timeline of the Weinstein case. Accusations of sexual misconduct have swirled around the film producer Harvey Weinstein in New York and Los Angeles long before he was on trial in Manhattan. The criminal sexual act charge involved Lucia Evans, a marketing executive who told investigators that Mr. Weinstein forced oral sex during a casting meeting in his Tribeca office in 2004. Mr. Weinstein's then lawyer, Benjamin Brafman, set the tone for his defense by saying that while he may have engaged in bad behavior, he had not committed any crimes. In a surprising move, prosecutors in Los Angeles charged Mr. Weinstein with raping one woman, groping and masturbating in front of a second within 2 days in February 2013. The California charges were filed even as the parties in New York gathered on the first day of the Mr. Weinstein's trial in Manhattan to discuss jury selection and other legal issues. 5 takeaways from the Weinstein verdict. Mr. Weinstein's lawyers also elicited testimony from one of Miss Shora's old friends, Paul Feldscher, who said that shortly after the incident, Miss Shora had not described it as rape, but as a crazy thing she had done with Mr. Weinstein. Although the jury acquitted Mr. Weinstein of more charges than he was convicted on, the verdict was a significant accomplishment for Mr. Vance and his office, which took a huge risk in bringing Mr. Weinstein to trial in the first place. Mr. Vance, a Democrat who has long considered himself an ally of feminists, came under enormous pressure to bring a case against Mr. Weinstein after the New York Times and the New Yorker published bombshell articles in October 2017 that detailed the stories of scores of women who accused Mr. Weinstein of abuse and harassment reaching back to the early 1990s. Finally, Ashley Judd and other Weinstein accusers respond to the verdict. More than 90 women have accused Mr. Weinstein of sexual misconduct, and the allegations against him set off a global Me Too movement. The story of #MeToo, of what the movement is about, is that men no longer have the tacit permission to use their power of prestige to sexually access girls and women's bodies. All of the women who spoke out about Mr. Weinstein, Harvey Weinstein, are heroes. The ones who received a guilty verdict, the ones who received a guilty verdict, and the many who didn't. Could the Trump administration block congestion pricing in New York? As part of the process, the agency will review the potential impacts of congestion pricing, including on infrastructure, traffic volumes, and congestive levels. MTA officials met or spoke with federal authorities about congestion pricing on at least 13 occasions between April and December last year. According to Kenneth Lovett, a senior advisor at the MTA, New York's congestion pricing plan requires federal approval because some roads within the designated congestion zone in Manhattan have used federal aid for construction. Obstacles in the federal approval process in New York may also ward off officials in at least 6 other cities that are considering their own congestion pricing proposals, observers say. Central Park races to save a rare duck gagging on a piece of plastic. Initially, birders rejoiced at the rare New York City sighting of a common merganser, an elegant-looking duck with a regal auburn crest in Central Park. But as photos of the duck spread quickly on social media, so did concern. A piece of discarded plastic appeared jammed in the duck's distinctive narrow bill, preventing it from feeding. Birds can become social media sensations within hours, as with the famous mandarin duck and the red-tailed hawk known as pale male. For New York City birders, the duck seemed to illustrate the specifics of a global problem. The duck has remained around the lake since Thursday near the Bow Bridge, mid-park at 72nd Street, said Mr. Barrett, who tried in vain on Sunday to approach the duck to remove the plastic. Canada oil sands plan collapses over politics and economics. Conservatives were quick to blame Mr. Trudeau for the loss of a project that they said would have created thousands of jobs and given an economic lift to the western province of Alberta, the hub of Canada's energy industry, which has suffered from low oil prices over the last 5 years. Kevin Byrne, a vice president and oil sands expert at the consultancy IHS Markit, estimated that for the project like Frontier to break even, the price of West Texas Intermediate oil, the North American benchmark, would need to average $65 a barrel over a decade or more operations. The Alberta Energy Regulator wrote in July that there will be significant adverse project and cumulative effects on certain environmental components and indigenous communities. Nevertheless, it approved the project after finding it in the public interest. Post-Brexit, Britain is going its own way. That way looks expensive. If Britain is serious about writing its own rules, its factories could lose orders from European companies that now pay them to make parts and tools. Part of Mr. Johnson's motivation to diverge from European rules is his eagerness to negotiate a trade deal with the United States, affirming his oft-repeated claim that Brexit is an opportunity for Britain to look beyond Europe. 8 out of every 10 cars made in Britain are exported, according to the European Automobile Manufacturers Association, a trade group. Intuit to buy Credit Karma to create financial data giant. The deal, which is being paid for with a combination of cash and stock, is aimed at creating a Silicon Valley financial technology company that can serve as an online financial assistant for people, helping them get their credit scores, file their taxes, and find new loans and financial products. Credit Karma grew to be worth billions of dollars by giving people access to their credit scores and then using the information to serve them advertisements for new credit cards and loans. Credit Karma says it has 100 million customers, including a third of all Americans who have a credit profile and half of all millennials. Trump administration considers punishing Chinese news organizations. The Trump administration is considering punishing Chinese journalists and state-run news organizations, as well as Chinese intelligence agencies, because of China's decision to expel 3 Wall Street Journal reporters, American officials said on Monday. A Chinese reformer, Liang Xiaozhuo, coined the phrase, the sick man of China, the sick man of Asia, in the late 19th century to describe the Qing dynasty. But Chinese officials argued after the column's publication it was an insult to the Chinese people and demanded that the journal apologize. Among the administration's concerns is a belief that, unlike American journalists, some of the Chinese journalists working for state-run news organizations in the United States are filing reports, at least part of the time, for Chinese intelligence agencies, according to people familiar with the matter. Unlike American journalists? Come on. Valerie claimed. After long wait, the markup is ready to show our work. Ms. Angwin said in a letter at the time to Mr. Newmark that Ms. Gardner, then the site's executive director, wanted to change the markup's mission to one based on advocacy against the tech companies, instead of producing meaningful data-centered journalism about the impact of technology on society. Ms. Gardner disputed the characterization in an interview with the New York Times. The staff now includes around 17 reporters, editors, and engineers. Ms. Angwin said, "Nobody needs another tech news site," Ms. Angwin said. Chris Matthews apologizes to Bernie Sanders for remarks on the Nevada win. The MSNBC star Chris Matthews issued an unusual apology to Senator Bernie Sanders on Monday night, a moment of humility for the veteran, hardball anchor, after days of mounting criticism from allies of Mr. Sanders, the frontrunner in the Democratic presidential race. Mr. Matthews, who has a reputation for pugnacious commentary, drew fire from Sanders' aides and at least one network colleague after he compared his victory in Nevada caucuses to the Nazi takeover of France in World War II. The general calls up Churchill and says, "It's over," Mr. Matthews said during a Saturday broadcast, as he tried to describe Democrats' surprise at Mr. Sanders' command over the party primary. Mr. Matthews carried on his show as usual, debating the merits of Mr. Sanders' candidacy with guests like Mayor Bill de Blasio of New York, a Sanders surrogate. Economy faces a coronavirus challenge as markets swoon. Fed officials have been unwilling to declare it a reason to move yet, but as they strike a wait-and-see pose, markets are increasingly betting that global economic and market fallout from the disease will push the central bank to lower borrowing costs. The Fed may have limited ability to counteract global economic fallout from the coronavirus, since its tools work to stoke demand if factories are not producing goods and supply chains are disrupted by quarantines. Cutting rates may do little to help. Fed officials have also been cautious in characterizing the coronavirus as a threat because it has been unclear how fast and how far it might spread. There is huge uncertainty surrounding the virus trajectory. Supreme Court seems ready to back pipeline across Appalachian Trail. Anthony A. Yang, a lawyer for the federal government, arguing in support of the pipeline's developers, said the trail administered by the National Park Service was distinct from the land underneath it. Chief Justice John G. Roberts, Jr., asked about the practical consequences of a broad ruling against the pipeline in the case U.S. Forest Service versus Cowpasture River Preservation Association, number 18-1587. "It really does erect an impermeable barrier," he said of the trail, "to any pipeline from the area where the natural gas, those resources, are located, and to the area east of it where there's more of a need for them. Michael K. Kellogg, a lawyer for environmental groups, disputed that, saying that there are 55 pipelines running under the Appalachian Trail, including some on federal land built before the federal law and others on state and local land. And that has been Reading the Times for February 25th. It is the year of Shaz 2020, the year of Shaz 2020.